The ground was hard, but the wind was harder. In September of 1873, the wind had an edge to it, a promise of teeth and malice that the town of Redemption chose to ignore. Agnes stood with her shoulders squared, a posture she learned was the only shield against words. In her right hand, she clutched a flour sack holding 2 books and a spare wool shawl. Her identical sister, Beatrice, stood beside her, a mirror of her stillness, holding a single, heavily rusted iron key between her thumb and forefinger. The cold did not care that they were 17. It did not care that they were alone. It simply was. Behind them, the door to the Redemption Foundling home closed with a sound like a bone breaking. Mrs. Gable, the matron, did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her words were sharp enough to do their work at a whisper. The Lord provides for the truthful, girls. The rest find what they deserve. The key in Beatrice's hand felt impossibly heavy. It was the only thing their parents had left them, a strange inheritance nobody in town understood. A key to a hole in the ground, a small cave on a worthless parcel of land 2 days' walk from town. A place no one had ever wanted. As the first hint of an early snow began to fall, that key was the only door left open to them in the entire world. If you are watching this from a warm room, a comfortable chair, tell us where you are. Tell us what the weather is like outside your window. We all have a key to a place we are afraid to unlock. Agnes and Beatrice were different. It was not a thing they decided, but a fact of their construction, like the identical spray of freckles across their noses or the quiet way they could finish each other's thoughts without a word. While the other orphans were taught scripture and stitchery, the twins were students of a different cathedral. They studied the sky. They kept a log, a cheap ledger book filled with their precise, shared handwriting. In it, they did not write prayers or poems. They wrote facts. The date the geese flew south. The depth of the first frost. The behavior of the squirrels, frantic and hoarding with a desperation they had not shown the year before. They noted the way the wind shifted, coming from the north with a new and persistent bite long before the almanac said it should. They observed that the mountain ash berries were thicker than anyone could remember, a silent warning from the earth itself. To them, these were not oddities. They were sentences in a language the town had forgotten how to read. To the town of Redemption, this was not wisdom. It was a form of pride, a quiet arrogance that unsettled people. The rejection was not a single event, but a slow, steady pressure, like a stone on the chest. It was in the way the other children would mock their little book of weather lies. It was in the way the storekeeper, Mr. Harris, would give them the oldest bread, his eyes lingering on them with a kind of pity that felt worse than contempt. The system of the orphanage, and by extension the town, was built on a foundation of predictable faith. You trusted the seasons to turn when the calendar said they would. You trusted the minister's interpretation of God's will. You trusted that hard work would be enough. The twins, with their quiet collection of observable truths, suggested a world that was not so orderly, a world that required a different kind of attention. This suggestion was treated as a heresy. Reverend Michael, a man whose piety was as thin as his winter coat, once saw Agnes marking the height of the creek after a rainstorm. He stopped, his face a mask of paternal disappointment. A woman's place is to trust the almanac of God, not the scribbles in her own little book. He said it loud enough for 3 other parishioners to hear. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were so utterly certain. He believed them. The whole town believed them. Their world had no category for 2 girls who trusted their own eyes more than the received wisdom of generations. The final break came in late August. Based on their observations, the early migration, the frantic animals, the deep chill in the nights, they made a prediction. They told Mrs. Gable that the coming winter would not be ordinary. It would arrive a month early and stay a month late. They said the snow would be deep enough to isolate the town completely. They advised her to lay in double the usual supply of firewood and flour for the foundling home. Mrs. Gable saw this not as a warning, but as a challenge to her authority and to the town's collective faith. She called it a lie, a story concocted for attention. When she found them showing their ledger to one of the younger boys, she declared it the final straw. They were corrupting the others with fear and falsehood. And so, They were cast out, sent to find what the untruthful deserve, with nothing but 2 books, a shawl, and a key to a cave. The walk was 2 days of methodical silence. They did not cry. Crying was a luxury, a waste of salt and water the body could not afford. They walked with a steady, ground-eating pace, the way their father had taught them before the fever took him and their mother. The first night, they slept in the lee of a rock outcropping, huddled together under the single shawl. The cold was a physical presence. It seeped through their thin coats, through their skin, and settled deep in their bones. Agnes's teeth began to ache from the constant, low-grade shivering. It was a deep, resonant pain that seemed to come from the root of her jaw. Beatrice felt a growing lightness in her head, a dizziness that made the horizon tilt if she stood up too fast. They ate sparingly from the small parcel of hard bread and dried apples Mrs. Gable had given them, a gesture of charity that felt more like a final judgment. The bread was stale. The apples were sour. But it was fuel. They measured it out. 2 slices of bread each, for apple rings. Morning and evening. They drank from streams, the water so cold it hurt their throats. The world was vast and indifferent. The mountains did not care about their plight. The sky, a sheet of hammered grey, offered no comfort. By the second day, the body's complaints grew louder. Hunger was no longer a dull ache but a sharp, twisting cramp in the belly. Every step sent a jolt of weakness up through their legs. Their fingers, exposed to the biting wind, went from burning with cold to a strange, painless numbness. Agnes looked at her hands during a brief rest. The fingertips were waxy and white. She tucked them under her arms, trying to force some life back into them, but they felt like foreign objects, bits of carved wood attached to her wrists. She could not feel them at all. That night, huddled in a shallow ditch lined with fallen leaves, the thought came. It arrived without ceremony, a quiet, reasonable whisper in the dark. Beatrice spoke it first, her voice raspy. "We could go back." Agnes didn't answer immediately. She thought of the foundling home. The lumpy mattress stuffed with corn husks. The watery oatmeal that was always cold. The endless mending of clothes that were not hers. It was a miserable existence, but it was warm. There was a roof. There was food, however meager. Here, there was nothing but the wind and the coming dark. This is where the story ends, she thought. 2 girls, frozen in a ditch, a footnote in the town's history. A cautionary tale about pride. Something pulled them back from that edge. It was not a sudden burst of hope. It was not a prayer. It was a problem. Agnes, reaching into the flour sack for their meager dinner, felt the bread. It was damp. A faint, musty smell rose from it. Mold. The last of their food was spoiling. The decision was no longer about comfort versus hardship. It was about action versus death. Going back would take a day. They might not make it. Moving forward, to the land their parents had left them, was the only choice that contained a future, however unlikely. "No," Agnes said, her voice firm. "We keep going." Her body made the decision before her mind caught up. She stood, her muscles screaming in protest, and pulled Beatrice to her feet. They found the cave at midday on the 3rd day. It was less a cave and more a scar in the side of a low hill, a dark slash in the rock face, partially hidden by overgrown hawthorn bushes. The entrance was small, barely tall enough to stand in. A wave of damp, earthy air washed over them, smelling of stone and deep, undisturbed soil. This was it. The inheritance. A hole in the ground. Beatrice slid the rusted key into the lock of a rotted wooden door that someone, generations ago, had wedged into the opening. The lock was frozen solid. It was useless. Agnes put her shoulder to the door and shoved. The wood, soft with decay, splintered and gave way with a groan. They stepped inside. The darkness was absolute. It was a cold, silent blackness that seemed to swallow the light from the entrance. For a moment, the despair returned. It was a tomb. But as their eyes adjusted, they saw the scale of it. The entrance opened into a large, cavernous space, the ceiling arching high overhead, lost in shadow. The floor was mostly level, packed earth and loose stone. It was not a tomb. It was a shelter. They explored deeper, their hands trailing along the cold, rough limestone walls. The air changed. 20 paces in, the biting wind from outside vanished, replaced by a still, subterranean chill. 50 paces in, the chill itself began to recede. Agnes felt it first, a subtle shift in the temperature on her cheek. The wall was no longer frigid. It was cool, but not cold. They kept going, moving toward the back of the cavern. And then they found it. A small, steady trickle of water seeped from a fissure in the back wall, pooling in a shallow basin of rock before draining away into the earth. Agnes knelt and dipped her numb fingers into the water. It was warm. Not hot, but warmer than the air, warmer than her own skin. A geothermal spring, a secret pulse of heat from deep within the earth. It was the land's quiet answer to the cruelty of the wind. They did not shout for joy. Relief was too shallow a word for what they felt. Beatrice sank to her knees on the stone floor. Agnes sat beside her, leaning her head back against the wall that was not trying to kill her. They sat in the deep, silent dark and felt something they had no word for. It was not happiness. It was not hope. It was recognition. This was the place. This was right. The first task was to create a barrier. The cave offered shelter from the wind, but the open mouth was an invitation to the cold. Using the small hatchet their father had left them, they began the slow, arduous work of felling deadfall pines from the surrounding woods. It was brutal labor. Their hands, unused to such work, were soon raw with blisters that broke and bled. Their muscles ached with a fire that never seemed to cool. But they worked with a silent, synchronized rhythm, two parts of a single machine. One would chop while the other dragged the logs back to the cave entrance. They did not try to build a cabin at first. They built a wall. They stacked the logs horizontally across the cave opening, leaving a small space for a door. They chinked the gaps with a mixture of mud, moss, and dry grass, creating a surprisingly effective seal against the wind. For a door, they used the remains of the old rotted one, reinforcing it with fresh-cut limbs and hanging their spare shawl over the inside for insulation. The world was now outside. They were inside. Next came fire. A fire near the front would be useless, the smoke would fill the cave. They needed a chimney. For days, they searched the cave, tapping on the walls, holding a lit candle stub to the ceiling, watching the flame. Beatrice found it, a narrow, vertical fissure in the rock, high up on one wall, about 30 feet back from their new front wall. It was a natural flue. Below it, they built their hearth. They gathered flat stones from the hillside, hundreds of them, carrying them one by one until their backs felt ready to snap. They built a raised stone hearth and a wide fireplace, mortaring the stones with the same clay and grass mixture they had used for the wall. The first fire they lit was small, tentative. The smoke hesitated, swirled, and then, miraculously, drew straight up the fissure and out of the cave. The smell of burning pine filled their home, a scent of safety and warmth. With a defensible space and a source of heat, the next battle was against starvation. Their books, one a worn copy of Thoreau, the other a practical guide to botany and herbalism, became their scripture. They set snares for rabbits and squirrels, learning from trial and error where to place them, how to bait them. Their first catch, a scrawny rabbit, was a victory they celebrated with a quiet, solemn meal. They wasted nothing. The meat was roasted, the bones boiled for broth, the skin scraped and set to dry. Jedediah found them in late October. He was a trapper, a man who lived so far on the fringes of society that most people in Redemption had forgotten he existed. He followed the thin, unfamiliar plume of smoke to their cave, expecting to find a squatter or a runaway. He found two 17-year-old girls, methodically stripping the meat from a freshly skinned deer. He stood in their doorway, a gaunt figure in buckskin, and simply watched. They did not seem afraid. Agnes looked up, nodded once, and went back to her work. He saw the neat stacks of firewood, piled 10 feet deep along one wall. He saw the stone fireplace, drawing perfectly. He saw the racks they had built near the fire, where thin strips of venison were slowly drying into jerky. He saw the order, the purpose, the sheer, unyielding competence. He had lived in the wilderness for 40 years and had never seen anything quite like it. He didn't offer help. He offered a trade. He had 2 deer from a successful hunt, more than he could process alone. He would give them one in exchange for help skinning and butchering his. They agreed. Jedediah became their ally. He was not a savior. They had already saved themselves. He was a repository of knowledge they could not get from books. He showed them how to render the deer fat into tallow for candles and waterproofing. He taught them which trees, the hardwoods like oak and hickory, made the best long-burning coals for the hearth, a fuel that would keep a low heat through the night. He showed them how to identify the late-season mushrooms that grew on rotting logs, and which roots could be boiled into a passable substitute for potatoes. In return, they gave him a place to warm his bones and share a meal that was not cooked over an open, smoky fire. He saw in them what the town refused to see, not 2 strange girls, but 2 deeply practical survivors. He recognized them. The great discovery, however, happened in the back of the cave. In the damp, warm air near the geothermal spring, Agnes noticed a patch of moss growing with an unnatural vibrancy. The earth there was soft and rich. An idea took root. They had light from their tallow candles. They had warmth and water from the spring. They had soil. Carefully, they dug up a small section of the cave floor, turning it over and mixing in leaf mold from the forest. In this small, subterranean plot, they planted the few seeds they had carried with them, scavenged from the orphanage garden, hardy lettuce, radishes, and kale. It felt like an act of absurd faith. Planting seeds underground in November. But the warmth from the earth was constant. The moisture was ever present. And slowly, impossibly, life emerged. Tiny green shoots pushed their way through the dark soil. The first proof came in early December, long after the first heavy snow had buried the world outside. Beatrice harvested a small handful of pale green lettuce leaves. They were delicate and crisp. They tasted of water and earth and defiance. They ate them slowly, savoring each one. It was not just food. It was evidence. It was the first crop of a harvest that should not exist. This was their proof. They were not liars. They were right. Word began to trickle back to Redemption. Jedediah, on a rare trip to town to trade his winter pelts, mentioned the girls. He didn't tell their story with any drama. He just stated facts. He told Mr. Harris at the general store that he'd traded for some dried venison that was as good as any he'd ever had. He mentioned, offhandedly, that the girls were comfortable and well-fed. The town's skepticism was a thick, comfortable blanket. Mr. Harris scoffed. 2 girls? Alone? They'll be crawling back here begging before the new year. Reverend Michael, hearing the news, warned his congregation about the pride that comes before a fall and the dangers of living unnaturally away from the community of faith. The people of Redemption listened and nodded. It confirmed what they already believed. The twins had been foolish, and the wilderness would be their punishment. Then the winter they had predicted arrived. It came not as a gentle blanket of snow, but as a fist. The temperature plummeted and did not rise. Snow fell for 3 days straight, then 4, burying fences and blocking roads. A second storm followed a week later, and a third after that. By Christmas, Redemption was cut off from the outside world. The supply train from the east was 2 months overdue. The town's reserves, calculated for a normal winter, began to dwindle at an alarming rate. Skepticism converts quietly, through hunger. By late January, the shelves at the general store were nearly bare. Flour was rationed by the cup. Salted pork was a memory. The communal woodpile was shrinking faster than anyone had anticipated. People grew thin. Their faces took on a pinched, grey look. Children's coughs echoed in the cold air of the church. The comfortable certainty of the town began to crack. The whispers started. The girls. The twins who had warned them. The liars. Maybe they weren't lying. The community did not convert in a great ceremony. It happened one family at a time. A farmer whose own smokehouse had run empty made the desperate, 2-day trek through the deep snow to the cave, following Jedediah's rough directions. He did not come to apologize. He came to trade his last 2 chickens for a side of smoked venison. Agnes and Beatrice made the trade without a word of reproach. They asked about his family. They sent him home with an extra bundle of dried herbs for his wife's cough. He returned to town and did not speak of miracles. He spoke of the weight of the meat in his pack. He spoke of the organized stacks of firewood he had seen. He spoke of the small, impossible green leaf they had given him to taste on his way out. Another family followed, then another. They came for what the sisters produced, not for the sisters themselves. They came because their children were hungry. Agnes and Beatrice helped them all. They gave what they could spare, which, thanks to their foresight and relentless work, was a significant amount. They did not preach. They did not say, "I told you so," they simply fed people. Their cave, once a symbol of their exile, had become the town's larder. The highest point of their success was not a moment of triumph, but the quiet, constant stream of desperate neighbors arriving at their door, and the equally constant stream of provision flowing back out. February arrived, the cruelest month. The town's hunger had deepened into desperation. One morning, a small procession appeared, dark figures struggling against the white landscape. Agnes saw them from the mouth of the cave. It was Reverend Michael, his face gaunt and stripped of its certainty. With him was Mr. Harris, the storekeeper, looking smaller and older than she remembered. They were not coming for their own families. They were coming for the foundling home. Mrs. Gable had run out of food. The children, the ones who had mocked them, were starving. The hardness in the Reverend had gone soft in the wrong direction, it had collapsed into a brittle kind of shame. He started to speak, a preamble full of scripture and regret. Agnes held up a hand, stopping him. She looked past him, at the path he had forged through the snow. Her response was not emotional. It was logistical. "How many children are there now?" The Reverend blinked, taken aback. 15. "How much can you carry back?" Beatrice asked, stepping forward with a canvas sack. They did not require an apology. They did not gloat. They filled the sacks the men had brought. Dried venison, smoked fish Jedediah had traded them, bundles of dried roots, and carefully wrapped parcels of their precious winter greens. The wisdom was entirely in the action. They saw a need, and they met it. The power had reversed completely, and no one mentioned it. As they prepared to leave, the Reverend reached inside his coat. He pulled out a small, leather-bound Bible, its cover worn smooth with time. "This was your mother's," he said, his voice quiet. "It should have been given to you when you left." He held it out to Agnes. It was not a full apology. It was a partial acknowledgement. A return of stolen property. It was an admission that a debt was owed. It had cost him something to carry it all this way, to admit the orphanage had kept it. Agnes took the book. "The snow is deep near the ridge," she said, her own form of forgiveness, a practical observation. "Keep to the trees on your way back." The winter finally broke in April. The town of Redemption survived. The story of the twins became a quiet legend, spoken not with admiration, but with a kind of grudging respect. They were no longer the liars. They were the ones who had seen the winter coming. Time passed. They never moved back to town. The cave was their home. They expanded it, building proper wooden rooms inside the stone walls, creating a workshop, a larger pantry, a warm kitchen. The front they built onto the cave was not a cabin, but a long, low porch where they could sit and watch the seasons turn. They acquired goats, whose bleating echoed pleasantly from a pen built against the hillside. Their home became a center of knowledge. People did not come for charity anymore. They came to learn. Agnes taught the young women how to read the signs of the earth, how to predict the weather by watching the clouds and the birds. Beatrice taught them how to preserve food, how to build a proper smokehouse, how to find the edible plants that the forest offered. They trained dozens over the years, ensuring the knowledge would not be lost again. They fed hundreds. The ledger they kept was no longer about the weather. It was a record of the families they had helped, the seeds they had shared, the lives they had sustained. They died as they had lived, together. It was a mild autumn afternoon decades later. They were old women, their faces maps of the years. They passed within a week of each other, sitting in their chairs on the porch. Beatrice had a cup of herbal tea, still warm, in her hands. Agnes had a small basket of saved seeds in her lap. From inside the cave home, they could hear the steady rhythm of a young woman they had trained, chopping vegetables for the evening meal. The work was continuing. They looked like two people who had just finished a long and satisfying book. The town buried them together, under a single, simple fieldstone. The epitaph they chose was short. It read, "They saw the winter coming." You have a key in your hand. You may not even recognize it as a key. It might feel like a burden, a strange inheritance, a dismissal. It is the key to a door no one else wants to open. Behind that door is a place that feels like an exile, a cave you were sent to, or a place you retreated to for your own survival. You are standing outside of it, in the wind, believing it is your tomb. It is not. It is your workshop. It is your larder. It is the one place the world cannot touch you, and the one place you can cultivate the gift the world told you was a lie. What winter are you preparing for? What quiet, impossible thing are you growing in the dark? That rusted iron key did not unlock a prison. It unlocked a kingdom. The world mistakes a shelter for a cage, until the storm comes and the walls of their own houses prove to be made of paper. If you believe the things that make us different are the very things that will save us, then subscribe. We have more stories to witness.